Okay, welcome everybody to the September Coordinating Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting. My first task is to advise everyone here that the meeting will be webcast for live or subsequent broadcast via the Council's YouTube site, and members of the press public may record and take photographs except where there are confidential or exempt items. And I have been told that because the microphone's over there, you will need to speak up, I understand.
Project,
yes. Are there any apologies?
We've had apologies from Councillor Penny Holbrook.
And Marion Carnberg
For lateness.
for lateness. Okay. As this is the first formal meeting since the AGM and Council, this is formally to note the appointment of the committee chair and deputy chair. And just on the deputy chair, can I move Liz Clements as deputy chair? Is that seconded? Okay, agreed. Thank you.
I didn't actually hear what you said. Who was it?
Liz Clements is now the deputy chair.
Mr. Bird.
Declarations of interest. Members are reminded that they must declare all relevant pecuniary and non-pecuniary interests arising from any business to be discussed at the meeting. If a disclosable pecuniary interest is declared, a member must not speak or take part in that agenda item, and any declarations will be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. The terms of reference are attached. A slight change in that we've now got equalities and social cohesion, which is the theme of today's meeting, now part of our remit from slight changes at the AGM. The action notes of the meeting, the 16th of April, 18th of June, and 9th of July. Are there any issues arising from those? Okay, well, as I mentioned, we took responsibility for qualities and social cohesion at the AGM, and I'm delighted to welcome Councillor John Cotton, Cabinet Member for Social Inclusion, Community Safety and Equalities, who will talk through those two particular aspects of his portfolio and touch on scrutiny as monitored progress and what you think we should be looking out for in the coming months. Over to you, Councillor Cotton.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everybody. It's nice to be back in a real scrutiny meeting. I'm joined for this particular item, two items I'm discussing with you today. For this particular item around the policies and inclusion agenda, I've got Waka Ahmed, who's our Assistant Director of Community Safety, Resilience, and is leading the equalities work as well. At the moment, on any technical operational questions that arise from what we've it's really important that we're focusing on this whole area of inequality, injustice and cohesion in our city. I think what we've been through over the last 18 months with the COVID pandemic has brought some of those challenges into very brutally sharp relief. We know that this has been a city that has been blighted by social and economic inequality for some time. COVID, I think, has served to intensify and make matters worse in many cases. It perhaps shone a new light and provoked a public debate about it, but these are also very long-standing issues. We've made it very clear that tackling inequality is a central aim and core business for the Council. That commitment to tackling inequality is now written into the Council's delivery plan. I think that's important to emphasise that this is something that, whilst I have portfolio responsibility for holding my colleagues to account, this is something that's shared right across the Cabinet and right across the corporate leadership team of the Council. So we say it's everyone's battle, everyone's business, but also argue in Council terms it's everyone's job as well to be focused on what they can do to address these issues. The focus of our work, the statement of intent that we published last autumn and then brought back as an action plan to Cabinet in May, everyone's battle, everyone's business, sets out really the kind of direction of travel and the areas where we think we as a council, either alone or in partnership with others, can have maximum impact. I think whenever we address issues of inequality, we also have to reflect the fact that we're operating within a national policy context as well. So not all of the levers sit within the council's hands or the hands of our partners within the city. So we can do certain things, but there's also a wider policy, economic and social environments as well. The Everyone's Battle, Everyone's Business Statement of Intent to Cabinet originally last September. We then went out to a process of wider public consultation. That was slightly trickier than I originally envisaged because it also coincided with the second and the third lockdown taking place. So we had to do a lot in online terms rather than face-to-face, as perhaps I originally preferred. That said, we still got an extensive response back to that consultation, and that helped to shape the action plan that we took to Cabinet in May. It's very much shaped by those conversations, feedback and dialogue. What we do within Everyone's Battle, Everyone's Business is essentially focus on three areas. So firstly, there's what we do to lead by example as an employer. Frankly, if we want to challenge inequality, we have to make sure we've got our own house in order and that we're leading by example ourselves. It then also goes on to talk about how we can tackle some of those wider structural inequalities and challenges. That's in partnership with others, as well as using our own resource and leadership. And thirdly, that broader piece about how we tell and share the stories of diverse Birmingham. It's an amazing city, as we all know, many different journeys, many different experiences, many different heritages that have brought people here. So there's a piece in the document also reflects on that as well. We also mapped the action plan onto the 5 quality objectives, which is the format that the briefing note takes. These are we're required under the Equality Act to set out the quality objectives of the council, so we've read across in that way. It's a big piece of work. There's still an awful lot to do. It's quite a hill to climb in some respects, but I do think the early progress that we've made has been encouraging. First of all, we have now put in place the new Qualities and Cohesion team to support the portfolio and provide some resource across the council. The recruitment to that has been taking place, is now almost complete, and there's a structure chart attached in the papers that sets out who does what. That team then helping us to put in place some robust mechanisms to challenge and drive progress and delivery. I chair a STAR chamber, similar to the one that my colleague Tristan Chatfield chairs with regard to finance on a monthly basis. We're using that firstly to challenge early drafts of the quality impact assessments. So we're checking, are we seeing best practice in our quality impact assessments right across the range of council activity. We're also using that STAR chamber as my monthly check and challenge against delivery within the Everyone's Battle, Everyone's Business action plan. So officers are being held to account in that way on delivery progress. We also, alongside that, have a specific focus on the workforce rate equity report, which we took to Cabinet at the same time as Everyone's Battle, Everyone's Business. And Craig, I'm sure will have some comments to make around that as well. And we're using that as a forum to challenge progress and also to horizon scan for any new or emerging issues. The second bit to this, I think, is about public accountability. Really welcome the fact of everyone's of scrutiny today to talk about this, and I'm really keen to explore how scrutiny can also support and add value to this accountability process, being an important part of that. I also said at the outset, to ensure public accountability against delivering the objectives we set ourselves, we would take regular reports on both Everyone's Battle, Everyone's Business and the workforce equity work to Cabinet. We had the first one of those a couple of months ago, and we'll be taking further reports in the autumn, because we want to be held accountable, frankly, for the commitments that are made. I think there is a frustration in this city at times that the commitments have been made around the inequality agenda that haven't necessarily been seen through systematically. I think that crosses all administrations of all parties, and we need to be held very visibly to account for the commitments that we've made. That's why I'm trying to put those processes in place to do that. I also think having that public accountability is really essential if we're going to ensure that all parts of the organisation are held to account and play their full part in delivering change. The written report provides some details around individual progress, so I'm not going to talk through every line and comma of it, but I just wanted to flag a few specific issues in my opening remarks here today. Firstly, those commitments that we made around workforce equity and leading by example. We made, I think, a very bold but absolutely pledge when we took forward the workforce equity work, which was that we pledged to have a representative workforce across all of our grades and to eradicate the race pay gap, which we were very upfront about, I think, in publishing last year, and to eradicate those by 2025. The essential first step to doing that was actually to get a proper picture of what our staff actually look like. there were some real gaps in the data that we had around the protected characteristics of our staff. So in 2019, we had no ethnicity data for 28.5% of the staff. There's been some really focused work that's taken place since we adopted the report led by Craig and his team. That focused work has now cut that data gap by 11.8%. There's more work to do, obviously, to reduce that gap further, but we've made, I think, sterling progress in the first aspects. And we're also looking at how we close similar gaps with regard to the other protected characteristics, so issues around disability, issues around sexual orientation. Starting to make changes to our recruitment procedures, including working to get female and Black, Asian or minority ethnic candidates on all of our shortlists. But there's also much wider work taking place behind that to improve our initial recruitment practices, so how we search for candidates and encourage candidates to come forward. And there's some good work that's done around the use of artificial intelligence with a couple of our recruitment campaigns, which seems to have borne fruit as well. The impact that's had on appointments at JNC level, because one of the big challenges being thrown out to us is the fact that we certainly do not represent the diversity of this city at the most senior management level. In September, between September 2020 and 2021, appointments, we have appointed 78% female and 35% BAME candidates to JNC level. That compares to the position in the previous 12 months, where those figures were only 38% female and 25% BAME. We've also seen some significant improvements below JNC level, and I think it's grade 7 is now perhaps one of the most diverse grades that we see. So that work is starting to bear fruit. I'm sure Craig can provide some further detail around that in questions. The other really impressive area of focus has been on the gender pay gap. This has now reduced from 9.3% in 2018 to 4.8% in 2020. So we are seeing some sustained progress, I think, there. The work to assess where we are with the race pay gap is currently underway. Craig and his team are crunching through the numbers on that, and that will form part of the progress report that we take back to Cabinet shortly. The second area I just wanted to touch on was the work that we're doing in partnership to tackle some of those wider economic and social inequalities. A couple of areas I'd really like to flag up here. The first is the work that we're doing around making Birmingham a real living wage city. In-work poverty and low pay remains an absolutely scandalous real issue, I think, for too many people in our city. We've been very proud now for nearly 10 years to be a real living wage employer in our own rights. And we've also been using our procurement muscle to drive take the real living wage amongst our contracting and supply chain as well. That is also aligned to the wider community wealth building work we've been doing, looking at how we can work with other public sector organisations in the city to maximise the impact of the Birmingham pound and ensure that it's driving up wage levels across the city. But what we wanted to do was also to work with our private, voluntary and public sector partners to put in a bid to make Birmingham a real living wage city and have us formally acknowledged as such by the Real Living Wage, the Living Wage Foundation. That isn't just about having a nice label or a plaque to put on the door. What we have to do to attain living wage city status is set out a very practical plan with some specific targets to increase the number of employers that are accredited living wage employers in the city, and also the number of workers who will benefit from receiving the real living wage. We're doing this through a partnership group that, as I say, has private sector, public sector, voluntary sector colleagues all around the table. We've had some very strong support from organisations like the Chamber of Commerce who've been real cheerleaders for this. And I have to say, despite the challenges that a lot of businesses have understandably faced as a result of COVID, the lockdown and the aftermath, they've been really active participants, and we're on course to make sure that that plan gets submitted at the end of the month. I think again will help to drive forward an assault against a real social challenge that we face in our city. The second piece of work that we're sponsoring has been the second round of the Birmingham Poverty Truth Commission. Some of you may have come across the first round of this, which was undertaken independently, was externally funded through charitable sources, and there was some leadership was given from the Bishop, amongst others. The Poverty Truth Commission is essentially about speaking a bit of truth to power, voices of lived experience of poverty, challenging some of our mindsets and preconceptions and policy choices. We've undertaken to sponsor the second phase of that and basically get that kind of voices my experience in-house and challenging what we're doing as a local authority. We're one of the few local authorities in the country that's actually looked to do this. I think that shows again we're trying to lead the way and finding different ways of taking this agenda forward. The citizen commissioners are currently being recruited. Initial focus of their work is going to be on some of our housing systems. And looking forward to working with them on that agenda. Finally, there's work that we're doing to strengthen connections between communities and with the many diverse communities in the city. We started work on refreshing and renewing the Birmingham Faith Covenant. This was a thing that we originally adopted back in 2014 to set out how we collaborate with the many different faith communities and organisations in this city. Often said that if you go out anywhere in Birmingham, you'll find it's often people of faith who are at the front line of some of the assault against poverty and disadvantage, whether it's staffing in food banks, whether it's kind of community support that we saw absolutely amazingly during COVID. So we're sitting down with our faith communities in the city and saying, well, how can we build on what we've learned during that COVID period? How can we work together even more closely on what are a set of shared objectives? We might have different ideological or theological motivations to what we're seeking to do, but I think our aim is absolutely the same. How do we reduce those gaps between the richest and poorest in our city? We're also looking at how we can maximise the opportunity provided by the Commonwealth Games to champion diversity and cohesion. That includes some work that's referenced in the notes around with BBSC on a new model of citizen engagement. So we've got some diverse voices shaping the community and the legacy aspects of the Commonwealth Games, and also how we can also use those voices to challenge some of our wider work as well. So we're looking with our new team in place also to work across all the directorates to ensure we use all the other opportunities that are out there to celebrate the city's diversity. So that's from the work that we're doing through the heritage strategy, some of the work that we've taken place in schools and so forth. So we are ensuring that all of those different stories of this city are celebrated and shared on a basis of equality and on a common platform. I think it adds to the rich story of our city, doesn't it? So that's kind of a brief headline canter around the main areas of activity. As the Chair said at the outset, really keen to look at how scrutiny can add value and support to the work that we're doing. This, I think, is an agenda where there's an awful lot of shared agenda and shared view across party and across partners. And certainly, I think scrutiny can play a really important role in not only holding me and my colleagues to account, but adding value to that wider piece of policy development. So I'll close at that point, Chair. I'm very happy to open up to discussion and take questions.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That was a very comprehensive summary of the key issues and progress today. Before I bring people in, I just wanted to say that in the past, not the recent past, but back in the day, equality was always seen about documents. You know, you have to have policies. And this council had more policies than it could. Yet progress was never monitored. It was as if that, of course, we believe in equalities and we're doing all we can because we've got these policies. You haven't mentioned any, or you mentioned one policy, which is good, but you talked about results, which is, I think, very, very encouraging. So I just wanted to say that at the outset. Councillor Kilner first, and then I'll bring in the brief you could indicate.
Chair. Thank you, Councillor Cotton, for your update and very, very comprehensive update. It's heartwarming to see that you're looking at breakdown of representation across the council and the services that we provide. You mentioned ethnicity as a recognised characteristic, and that's something that you're looking to focus on in terms of ensuring that we have appropriate representation of different groups. However, we've only got one chart in the document which basically puts all Asians into one category, Black into one category. But as I'm sure you're aware, Asian is a massive category and so is Black. So are you looking, as you're moving forward, are you looking to break that down further in terms of the different categories within the bigger categories so that we have a clearer picture of exactly what our representation looks like and what our services, in terms of our service provision as well, And also it would be good as you're progressing this work to get some feedback as to the progress of how you're ensuring that the representation is across the board. So charts that do define the different characteristics within ethnicities, religion, etc. as well, and how we're progressing and making changes across the council in further streaming.
Do you want to deal with one at a time?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, if you can respond, and then I'll bring in other people.
Thank you. I think that's a really valid challenge, and it picks up on the point that I made in the outset around the fact that we started from a position of a big gap in terms of data. Now, I think that speaks to some of the other challenges perhaps we face in the organisation about the degree of trust that staff felt in coming forward with data. So a lot of work that's been done around trying to build staff confidence in coming forward, and that's how we managed to reduce that data gap. But absolutely what we want to do is then start to unpack, to understand the true diversity of our staffing program in the city. Because you're quite right, there's a lot of feedback during the consultation around everyone's platform did focus on the use of that portmanteau term fame. And I can understand why it feels so uncomfortable for some people, because there's a lot of diversity that gets captured within a very short label. And if we really want to understand people's needs, people's aspirations, we've got to get underneath that. So that's certainly ongoing. And also we're looking at how our wider monitoring work as well picks up on those very issues. So we've got a true picture of what the honesty of the city looks like, and that we're responding accordingly, and that ultimately our workforce and our policies reflect that in a far more meaningful way. But we'll certainly be bringing that back as part of the future feedback on the progress that we're making.
So can I just go back on that? So when you're capturing that and you're changing the way that we capture data, I mean, that's quite easy in terms of when we're providing services and we're asking people for a breakdown of quality data of service delivery. Is that something that you think that you can do imminently? Because obviously when you gather data from other people, you ask them to provide. So we're progressing the agenda a lot faster than implementing our policies before we start going out. So it's something quite easy when we're sending out the data to capture our service delivery, to understand actually whose needs are we meeting and where are the gaps. So that's something that can be done quite quickly. So how quickly are we looking at doing?
So I don't know the back I might want to add something on this, but certainly this is one of the early job priorities for the equalities team. So I know at the moment that they're looking at the characteristics and categorisations that we use in our equalities monitoring work. We've tended in the past, I think, to follow the Office for National Statistics framework. But I think you can argue quite strongly that doesn't actually capture the diversity of a place like Birmingham anymore, because we've got a lot more that sits underneath those headline categories. Don't know, Wacko, if you wanted to add anything on that.
Yeah, we're also developing an equalities observatory in the council as well, and that will essentially build on exactly what you described, to make sure that all of our policies and our delivery is based on what our city looks like. So that work will build on that. And building on the point, I suppose, that Councillor Cotton has raised in terms of the national data as well. We're also testing this through with our staff networks. So we've started a process of consultation with the Diversity Alliance Network. We've got the formation of a new Asian Alliance Network, where there's a lot of work that we're doing with the Corporate Black Support Workers Group. And this protected characteristics, the way the council uses data, will be part of the consultation that we'll be doing internally, as well as what we'll be doing externally. The Equality Observatory hopefully will be able to give us much more evidence and data-led stuff that will actually a lot of targeted work based on the issues and the inequality that we see in the city as well. So that's something that we're working on at the moment. I'm not sure what the time frames are. I think that's imminent, isn't it? The work on the Equality Observatory. And we'll obviously have more data that we can share with scrutiny and others as a result of that.
Would it be possible to get that data time frames and screen members?
Yeah, that's all.
Councillor.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. You just touched on it, having loads of policies on equalities. What we'd like to see, as the Chair said, progress and milestones and data, which is really, really important on how the scrutiny can help to develop that, and actually progress and how far we are. If we have milestones or if we haven't reached them, but we've still got 4 vacancies on this chart that you showed. You know, we must have, you know, by this time we should have recruited, and I think the diversity has got to start within that, and we need to see the makeup of the council in all the grades, so we know where the gaps are. So that information would be very, very useful for scrutiny. Yes,
And I think that the milestones point is a particularly important one because that was in framing the action plan, both for everyone's battle, everyone's business, and the action plan for workforce equity. I think I probably drove my car and created a distraction at times just by pushing on the need for dates, for absolute targets for things that we were going to do. Because I've said at the outset, I think there's been a lot of frustration over the years about, yes, we are broadly committed to the principles of equality, but where's the practical outcome and the proof that you change? So that's why we've kind of embedded milestones and also put that monitoring and accountability process into what we're doing as well, so that we are driving it exactly that way. On the point with team vacancies, we're almost fully staffed now. It was one of my frustrations was we kind of secured the budget to set up the team, and then immediately went into the COVID scenario, which really held up recruitment, which is unfortunate, but I think somewhat unavoidable. But I have to say that we've got a team in place now. We've got some really good people who are, incredibly committed to the work they're doing, and quite excited about taking this agenda forward, which is always good to see.
Roger, did you?
I did, yes.
Yes, I thought so.
I was seeing it's
It's
not
like-
bold enough in a way.
It's like being at an auction. Any of you ever bought things that you didn't intend to buy? It's an auction. Right.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that we're discussing this report on a day that we are celebrating a new British sporting hero, who is a woman, Chinese and Romanian parents, born in Canada, which is fantastic. Fantastic that such a diverse society shows what can be achieved, but obviously the purpose of this report is challenges. What I suppose I would particularly like to pick up, I echo the comments that have already been made about results rather than plans and so on. And I would like to thank Councillor Cotton for the time he has spent sharing with himself, Councillor Fowler, on a cross-party basis. This work this is an area where there is huge cross-party agreement. I think that's really important that we continue to do that. And I'm committed that my party will continue to support that. And I would just like to pick up a couple of points in terms of a couple of groups that we may miss perhaps some focus on. One is, sadly, a group I think we're going to have for a long time in the future, which is those who are in temporary accommodation for homelessness, and the opportunities they risk missing out because of the length of time they're going to be in temporary accommodation and the increasing volume of people in that situation. The basic dynamics of the socially rented housing market are moving in the wrong direction and look like to continue to do so in the future. So we need to ensure that group do not suffer disadvantage. They will suffer disadvantage, but that disadvantage is minimised as much as we can through support to them. And the other that I think is really important we focus on is Hong Kong nationals. I think, with everything else that's going on, there's perhaps not that much focus on that group, but I think that is likely to be a huge source of net migration into the country, given the commitment the government's made to allow a significant portion of the Hong Kong population to come here. It's clear that day by day, the Chinese government is restricting the freedoms of people in Hong Kong. And I've talked to some people who've recently come to Birmingham from Hong Kong to live. And what they say is, well, the Hong Kong of today is not the Hong Kong I was born into. It's not that country. And I'm very grateful for the British government allowing me to come to a country where we have those freedoms that I was born with and have been taken away. And I think we will see a very large group of people who share that view. It won't all be in a rush. I mean, it'll be a gradual process, because I think it'll be a very significant process. And we just need to make, I mean, those people will come well educated by and large. You know, we've got a lot to offer, and a huge opportunity for this country to use their talents for our future success. But we do need to make sure that they get the respect and the opportunities that they should have, and then we need to make sure our systems are there to ensure that that happens. There aren't any unintended, processes of discrimination against them.
Thank you, and if I can, without making it sound like an absolute loving, also thank yourself and Councillor Fowler. They've been regular virtual visitors to my attic over the course of lockdown. It has been really helpful, I think, to have that partnership approach on this agenda. I think the groups that you identify there, absolutely. The situation in regard to temporary accommodation and homelessness, I do fear will remain a challenge with us for some time. And that's part of the reason why we looked at the Poverty Truth Commission to have that kind of focus on housing and homelessness in that second phase, because I think we do need to be listening to the voices of lived experience in that area. I think it's also an area where, as I said at the outset, not all the levers are in our hands here in the council or in Birmingham, but let's look at what we can do within the confines that we have to address some of those challenges. The issue of the Hong Kong nationals, I think we may come back to this. Of course, we move on to the City of Sanctuary item shortly. But absolutely agree with what you say there. We've already been in dialogue with government, with the Chinese Community Centre in the city, looking at how we welcome and support those Hong Kong nationals who are arriving in the city. We do know that there's a lot of the community links that the people arriving from Hong Kong will come to Birmingham because they have those connections here. I've also been invited and accepted to sit on a national panel of local authorities working with the Ministry of HCLG around this agenda, so picking up on the kind of learning points that we're having and trying to get a common national approach. But that's something that I'll be very happy to come and talk further about as that agenda develops, as it will, I think, over the coming months.
Councillor Pocock.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Welcome, Councillor Cotton. I was on this council first elected 10 years ago, nearly 10 years ago. At that time, the Bishop of Birmingham was running something as a convention of some kind. I've got a feeling your fingers were in that pie at some point as well. It was a really broad and sweet view about inequalities in the city, as I recall it. A lot of participation. I remember sitting on a workshop about urban design, I think it was. I just wonder, it's great to hear the progress being made with their own workforce, in particular reported today, but it may be time next year possibly to have a stock taking 10 years on. Could we prompt maybe a broad range of faith communities to initiate an inequalities review perspective on it there? And the Councillor Afghan's point here that is 10 years. We've made some progress here very recently, but on this committee, I think probably 5 years ago, Councillor Aswell pointed out, and that was Councillor Aswell, the poor state of equality in their own workforce. Nothing seemed to be happening. There was a huge gap as you went up the pay grades. We have at last got on top of that, and that's nearly 10 years' work. The Commission itself, as I recall it, was blunt in saying this is a generational job we have in mind here. And therefore, I think if we can stand back, not to the city to lead this, but to practice, I think, amongst its wider community, to do a stock take 10 years on, where have we made progress? Is business dragging its heels? Is that moving forward? Urban planning continues to be a hard wiring in the city of inequalities. So what can we do to address that with public support? I think a stock take of that sort would be very helpful, and I'm sure this committee and the council generally could add some scrutiny input to that review.
Yeah, the social inclusion process is the thing that you're talking about. There's a chair covered by the bishop. Yeah, was involved in that actually for a couple of years, 10 years ago. Yes. And actually that I think where we are with everyone's battle, everyone's business is very much the kind of continuation of the ethos that we adopted the social inclusion process. And there was some really good stuff that had practical consequences from the social inclusion process. We have a network of places of welcome around this city in neighbourhoods that grew out of social inclusion process. A lot of the original work around tackling work policy, so the original work around the real living wage. Some of the shaping of our, when we took on responsibility, for instance, for local welfare provision and so forth, came out of the work and the discussions for the social inclusion process. So I think you're absolutely right. It would be a pertinent moment to look at, do that kind of stock take, and again, provide some further accountability for the commitments that we've given under everyone's battle, everyone's business. We have already been having some initial discussions about some form of bringing together the various partners. Clearly, that's not been possible in the 18-month period that we've just been through, but really keen to try and approach that. And indeed, when we undertook the consultation last autumn, there's one very good session that was facilitated by BBSC, which engaged a wide number of voluntary community and faith organisations in that conversation. So there really is an appetite out there to make that happen. As I say, it's not something that we can do alone. We actually need this kind of army of volunteers and citizen activists who are doing that work day in, day out in communities. So yeah, absolutely up for doing that.
If I could just add to that briefly, Chair, I think if we then were to get more specific about the 10-year forward, but 22 to 32, and again, to Patrick's point, perhaps be a bit more quantitative in the targets and progress and set up a tracker actually in itself provides a momentum of progress.
And I also think that's about the contribution that other agencies in the city have to make to that. So you've got the big piece for health, there's a big piece for some Department of Work and pensions. If you're going to deal with one of a deeply entrenched set of economic and social inequalities, they've got to play their role as well. And we've seen the impact that we can have when we join that up. So some of the community wealth building work that we do, for instance, where we mobilise the collective financial and resource muscle of universities, of the NHS locally, some of our housing association colleagues, it's delivered real change to local communities in terms of jobs, in terms of investment in facilities. So I think the appetite is there to do it, some of the resources there to do it. You just got to pull it all together in the way that you're talking about.
Councillor Oldham.
Well, thank you. Listening to the presentation and the discussion we've had, there seems to me one group that doesn't get much of a mention, and that's elderly people. We talk lots about young people and different ethnic minorities, but we don't hear much about the older people in this city. And while it may be predominantly a younger city, there are a large number of elderly people. And one area particularly which concerns me, where I think elderly people can feel they're forgotten and nobody cares, is about the pavements and walking. Because for elderly people, it's quite important to get out and walk, firstly for their health, and secondly to combat loneliness. But our pavements, frankly, if you live in a ward where we have scooters, are a menace to elderly people. To start with, the pavements aren't very even, and many of the places I've pointed out to the engineers where it is uneven and elderly people might trip and they still won't repair them because it doesn't meet the criteria, which is, well, that's the council, that's us, that's something we could do. And the fact that bicycles and scooters, despite the fact that they are not supposed to, continually ride on our pavements. And the police don't want to know, and Voy don't want to know. And for an elderly person walking along slowly, perhaps with a walking stick, that is really frightening. They come up behind, you know, they're usually young people. Elderly people are afraid to say anything, or if they do say anything, they get a mouthful of abuse back. And so I'd like to know what we're doing to make our older people feel that they are wanted in this city.
So there's a couple of things on that, Councillor Alden. First of all, with regard to those sort of road and access issues, one of the members of the New Equalities team will have that accessibility officer role. So we'll be very much in that, looking at how we're ensuring that people can move around safely, that buildings are accessible, that the roads and pavements are also accessible as well. So that will be a key part of their role. I've also been involved in some discussions with the old people's and disability organisations around this agenda as well. So I am trying to provide a challenge from my perspective around that. Then more broadly on this, the inclusion of elderly people. I think one of the really impressive pieces of work that's taking place on this at the moment is the work that's taking place under Councillor Hamilton's portfolio through neighbourhood networks. So the commissioning of voluntary organisations to provide a range of activities and supports to keep people engaged, to break down isolation and to ensure that people remain active, because we know that if those things aren't happening, the fact that people can then physically and mentally deteriorate and will ultimately need statutory social care, which is, you know, regardless of the resource implications of that, frankly, is no outcome for an individual. So I think certainly the continued investment in neighbourhood networks, and a report went to Cabinet, I think it was earlier this week, around the expansion and further entrenchment of neighbourhood networks is a really good example of how we can do that. So and I continue to have conversations with Councillor Hamilton on that. The other thing that I'm doing for Councillor Hamilton in that regard is the City's Health and Wellbeing Board has established a series of subcommittees. I chair the one around creating a city without inequality, and those issues around the inclusion of all groups, including our older citizens, are very much in our mind as we're taking that agenda forward. We've said that what we want to do is take the Marmot principles and actually entrench those in our approach to health and wellbeing when it comes to tackling inequality. And I think the kind of interesting issues that you're talking about, they're very much part of that work. And I'll be, again, very happy to come back with some more detail about as we take that forward. But I think the point's well made, and it is important that when we talk about inclusion, this is about every group in the city.
Sorry, back over to you. Yeah, I'd just like to add, for future development in the city as well, and the focus that we've got on our quality impact assessments, we are now asking services to really look into the age profile within that and go beyond just youth facilities. So when we're looking at developments, in fact, we had a conversation yesterday at our chamber as well, where services are now having to consider the role of elderly people, and when developments are now being built around the city, that they're looking at not just accessibility in the home or new builds within the home, but where open spaces are now being designed, where parks, etc., are now being designed, that there is a consideration for the elderly as well. So all of our quality impact assessments coming forward in the future, the age characteristic will make sure that the focus is beyond young people, and it includes the elderly as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Campbell.
Thanks very much, Chair. First of all, I'd like to say I think this is a really well-written strategy, and I'd like to focus particularly on the equity. I think the notion that you brought in of equity and looking at the fact that people are subject to multiple forms of disadvantage, and we need to be looking at the outcomes and thinking about that when we're allocating resources, that seems to me absolutely key. So I'd like to commend whoever wrote the sections about equity, because I think that it's the mindset that we're applying to this is really, really important. It's not, and so we need to be looking at the outcomes of everybody in the city. So again, that's where I felt very pleased when I was reading this document. I think that hasn't moved on from the sort of policy documents that were familiar with this organisation, over the previous decades. But to be more challenging, I just want to ask about recruitment practice, because really, and John and I have talked about this before. So John has just said in his presentation that there will be a attempt to ensure that there's a female candidate and an ethnic minority candidate on every shortlist. And I know that there are constraints in employment law, but to me that just seems terribly unambitious. So I want to know, what are we doing actively within what's permissible under law to go out and look for the most diverse field of candidates at all levels? And I'm interested at entry-level posts as well as the most senior management and middle management. And then I just want to know that we're undergoing a major restructuring and reorganisation. And is there a tension between the need for continuity and the need to allow people to sort of progress within the organisation and the need to bring people in from outside? Because I think that when you look at the management tiers in this organisation, the middle management upwards, yes, we've made progress, but it in no way reflects what you see out there in cities and communities. And I think for young people from ethnic minorities in the city, I think they would be quite right to sort of be feeling concerned that they might not be able to make the sort of career that they would like in the city council as compared to some private sector organisations in the city. So this week we've had KPMG also starting to make announcements about past background of their candidates and how people progress in their organisation. So I think we've got a range of factors that we need to take into account. But I think in our recruitment practice, we need to be bolder, or I'd like to hear what we're doing, which is not just some tokenistic stuff about shortlists.
I'll bring Craig in on a number of those points because he'll be able to give you some greater detail. Just if I can from my perspective, the issue around shortlisting was kind of the thing that attracted a lot of headline attention and everything else. But I think I think it's important that we did that because we have to draw that line, as it were. But I think we've always been really clear that that doesn't solve these problems alone, and a whole lot of work that needs to take place behind that, from how we approach initial recruitment through to the cultural change that we need within the organisation, so people feel they can come forward with big self-protected characteristics, for instance, and also the kind of organisational development offer that sits behind it. So I've always been quite clear in saying, look, this is not the entirety of what we're trying to do. There's a whole set of work that needs to sit behind that I think is quite challenging at times for the organisation to step up to, but we have to. But then, Craig, if you just want to take through some of the stuff we're doing around engagement.
Absolutely, and I'm reinforce that, Councillor Cross, actually, because in any year we recruit about 10% of the workforce, so 90% of the workforce stays with us. So it's really important that whilst recruitment is absolutely essential to bring talent into the organisation, we also need to make sure we're focusing on that internal resource as well, enabling people to feel able to progress through the organisation where they have aspiration for greater progression. However, to answer the particular question, we are changing the recruitment processes. What we're doing right now actually is I'm on a bit of a rollout with directors talking about changes that we're making specifically with regards to anonymised blind recruitment processes to take away any unconscious bias from processes. What we're also doing is we've recognised that in order to recruit, to select people into the organisation, you need to have people apply for positions within the organisation. That is, if you were only fishing from one pool, you were only going to get the same kind of fish. And I think that part of the challenge has been around ensuring that we are an organisation that sees and is a place for all people of all types to feel that they want to aspire to work for. So what we're absolutely doing is working with colleges and universities. We're looking at where we place our adverts, where we place our recruitment activities. We're doing some work at the moment with regards to service leavers from the armed forces, etc. We're working with the Shore Trust, but what we're also doing as well is changing where we can the routes to application, because what we recognise is our application process can actually switch people off. So again, if we're not attracting people and then they're dropping off as we get through the application process, we're not then seeing that true diversity through the application process. So we're adapting in pockets and we're piloting different ways that we're enabling people to apply for the job. So we're having people do videos. We've just been through an NGDP, National Graduate Development Programme application process, where people did sound bites and we were then judging sound bites and then taking people through to the next stage based on that. Doing much more behavioural based recruitment processes as opposed to technical based recruitment processes. So we're doing a heck of a lot in that space, and it is starting to bear fruit, but it's, as somebody mentioned earlier on, it's a generational change. It's going to take some serious time to get the kind of real big proper impact that we need. We're seeing those early signs, and they are coming through at all levels. So we're seeing increased diversity, representation, inclusivity at all levels, from grade 1 through to J&T. We just need to continue to push the agenda.
Councillor McKee.
Thanks very much, Carl. And I think it's a question I'll ask you, because it was a question that I used to ask Christian, who did the role before you, and Councillor Zappa before that, and Councillor Sharp before him. And I'll
just text them and see what they say.
Yeah, well, that'd be interesting, the answer, because I think it's one of the most important portfolios in the cabinet. If you get it right, we've got a very vibrant, cohesive society that gives you a forward-going council. Get it wrong, and the area itself just basically implodes upon itself. And yet it's got the lowest budget. Now, forgive me if it's changed, but it's always used to have the lowest budget of all the departments. A lot of that was down to the fact that the responsibility for implementation was in the other portfolios. It's your job to hold other people to account. So I always used to ask them, can you give me some examples of how you've held those other departments to account to make sure that they have delivered what they're supposed to be delivering? Because us in this room talking about this, and as you're right, been involved with some areas of this myself, and it is the most cross-party piece I think the time that I've been involved with, I think it was only one meeting where sort of Roger and I had to say, well, come on a bit. And that was only because something didn't go far enough. It wasn't that we weren't happy with what was happening. So, you know, there is the support of the committee and all the parties behind you here, really. So it's just, how are you doing that to make sure that those other departments deliver on what they're supposed to be doing?
So I think my first act was actually to get a slightly bigger budget. And I had a word with my predecessor who suddenly found himself in charge of the money and said, Tristan. So we did. So we secured resources which is now being invested into the building of that qualities team. So we've actually got some people who are able to support the portfolio across the council, which I think we'd acknowledge. We do appreciate the previous engagement on this. We didn't perhaps have sufficient resource internally to take that forward. That's then enabled us to start to put in place some of those other mechanisms I've talked about challenging. So I think the establishment of the Equality Style Chamber. So we now have a monthly roundtable meeting where we're able to probe into specific areas of council activity, to bring in directors and other senior officers and other cabinet members and get right into the body of what's happening in the area where the equality challenges are. It's also been used, as I say, as a mechanism in addition to holding to account about these two landmark pieces of work with regard to workforce equity and everyone's back to everyone's business. It's also enabled us to, I think, better marshal some of the external resources that we can join up with our own. So I think the partnership work that we do with Living Wage City is a really good example of that. So we've been able to lever in support of the Chamber and other organisations, but having some internal resources made those conversations easier to undertake. And certainly that's something we'll be taking forward as we look at the next phase of this, some of the stuff that Councillor Pocock was talking about earlier on about how we marshal that wider army of citizens and voluntary activity. So I think we've made some progress in strengthening the mechanisms that we have to ensure challenging accountability. And yes, I did squeeze a little bit of extra cash out of my predecessor.
Councillor Mann.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, John, for your presentation. I've just got a couple of questions and just one comment. In relation to the Commonwealth Games, you say that the report says that embedding equalities across the Commonwealth Games legacy. Just a question is, how will this be done? And then further in your report, it does say that the voices of community to be at the heart of the delivery plan. I just wanted to know, how do you intend on those voices being captured and also heard? This one's just more of a comment. I just wanted to say that I'm pleased to see the section on language counts. And I think that this needs to be adopted across the council. As our citizens of Birmingham don't really want to hear council jargon, and I think talking in a language that is easily digested is key in breaking down any barriers. And then finally, obviously a lot of the presentation made reference to things like sort of post-COVID and some of the things that we learned from having the pandemic. And he also highlighted how people with certain characteristics were impacted differently by the COVID pandemic. And I quote, part of the presentation, there also is clear evidence of the disproportionate impact of poverty with women, people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities and those with disabilities are all facing a higher likelihood of living in poverty. I just wanted to ask, what proactive steps are being taken to recognise those individual differences and to try to tackle them? I can see the wider sort of broader ways of how we would be tackling, such as building cohesion and things like that. But I'm just wondering if there's any work being done specifically in what we've recognised as those groups of people who have been seen to be disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. If there's anything at the moment in specifically targeting or trying to deal with those differences. Yeah, they're my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine. So just to pick up, I think thank you for pointing out the thing around language counts, because it's been one of my frustrations over the years. I think we're always prone in local government occasionally to lapse into jargon because it's comes to the territory to an extent. But I think just constantly challenging ourselves over the words and terminology that we're using and ensuring that it is actually accessible to the folks that we're here to represent is absolutely key, which is why we wrote it into the document. And again, that's something that has to be owned by every part of the organisation. So yeah, really important point there. In terms of embedding the qualities in the legacy of the games, we're doing some work at the moment, so Michael may want to touch on the work that he's doing in this regard as well, around ensuring that we've got some diverse community voices informing the work of the organising committee, and also the work that we're doing to underpin that legacy, because we need to be listening, I think, to the full range of the diverse voices within the city. The organising committee have also now appointed a head of equality and inclusion, who I had my initial meeting with earlier this week. A lot of the objectives that they're setting out for inclusion very much reflects the kind of approach that we're taking in on everyone's written. So part of my agenda items for the further conversation with her is about, right, how do we use the resources that you've got to help support what we're trying to do? So that I think will enable us to use I think the games has the potential to be a real engine for securing that wider agenda. I don't know if I've got. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, sure. So as Councillor Cotton said, we're ensuring that the ethos of everyone back everyone business and our work on equality goes across all of the Commonwealth Games themes. There's a particular legacy theme around strong communities where we will use the games as a bit of a springboard by sharing some of the activities that we will run around Know Your City, Inclusive City, and Connected City. A series of activities that we've commissioned BBSC to go out to a public commission, and imminently, I think it's at the end of this month or at the start of the next month, where we will encourage some activities coming across. On the point of residents, part of the legacy work that will come out of the city is we are about to get a panel, a community panel that will reflect all of our cities. So there will be membership from across different constituencies, as well as some of the organisations that we have in the city that are already representing the project. And not just to scrutinise and help scrutinise the work that we've got around legacy themes within the Commonwealth Games, but then to use that to then drive forward our work on everyone back, everyone's business, so that we also have scrutiny and accountability with the public. So that will be something that will come out of the games, but then be part of the everyday consultation, community consultation that we will have, where we will have residents also taking part in a similar function to this, looking at the actions that we've got, looking at the data we have, and also championing their constituents in their areas and challenging us about the work that we are doing targeted within those institutions as well. And then just on that wider point around tackling poverty, and you're absolutely right. Again, COVID is just, it's slightly frustrating discussion for me at times, because some of the media commentary would always suggest that we've suddenly discovered that inequalities are things since COVID. That's actually all it's done, is just exposed structural issues that we know have been there for a very long time. So I think in terms of how we're trying to address those specific issues, one is going back to the role that we need to play leading by example. So that work we're doing around gender and race inclusion within our workforce, because I think we can't hold a finger and wag it at others if we've got issues within our own organisation as well. So I think that's really important. Then I think some of this is around the wider partnership activity as well. So the work that we're doing around things like the real living wage, tackling in-work poverty, which of course disproportionately affects women in particular. There's then, I think, a series of challenges that have been exposed around disability. A couple of months ago, I was involved in a piece of work with Little Men Cap around the impact on citizens with learning disabilities as a result of the pandemic. That's now something we're trying to build into the approach that we're taking through the Health and Wellbeing Board, looking at what specific further steps we need to take to break down some of those barriers. There's a lot of work that needs to be ongoing. I think the other bit that's key to this is just ensuring that we continue to invest in the kind of preventative and early intervention services right across the council, with that stuff that's affecting housing and that stuff in social care. That is absolutely key to just stop people tipping further into crisis. If we're not doing that, then we're not going to do anything to tackle those inequalities in their sense. And just to add, if I can, we're also working very, very closely as a team with the Public Health Division. So all the work that they've done during COVID in terms of the research and the data that they've picked up will form the input into the Equality Observatory, and will also form the input into the Equality Division team. So we will be sharing data. Two of the members of staff that we've got in the team, we are using as data apprentices, so that the data collation that then comes into the team will then reflect all the good work that's been done. So all of the work that Dr. Justin Ryan's team has done with regards to community engagement as a result of the inequality that they found from the report that they did, that is also then feeding back into the cohesion team in terms of the added consultation and work that we need to be doing with them as well. So there is close collaborative work now taking place between the team that is now in place as well as the consultant.
The only person who hasn't asked a question is now going to ask one. Councillor Cathy.
Thank you very much, Chair. John, it's a big piece of work. You've got your hands full there with your officers, and you've given us a good document today. It's got a lot in there. My first observation is in your forward, actually, because you talked about English local government. Frustratingly, is a deeply underpowered creature compared to our American European counterparts. People will read these documents. I would only say to you on my first observation, if you're going to make a statement, back it up with an example. I had to Google for reports on that to see what you meant. So if you say something, please just that sort of comment, just put in for people what you're referring to and why you're saying it, because it's quite a bunch, and people might not realise why. So I Googled it, but yeah, okay. Moving on. You talked about Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government when you started to speak. I think you might be coming back to us on that. I'm not sure if I caught that right. So you said you'd share that work. And that's really what my question is around, because obviously you've been very brave in Birmingham to tackle this and take on the issues that we've got at hand. But I suppose my question to you is, what are you doing for best practice? Because Birmingham, you talk as if we are leading, Birmingham is really doing this, and we want the data, we want the outcomes, but national, because you talked about levers and you mentioned national levers, so it's not just down to Birmingham. And yes, you are factoring it because it's our city, why wouldn't you? So I was just interested in those national levers that you mentioned, and if you have really looked at best practice elsewhere in the local authorities. I might have missed it in the document, sorry if I did. I just wanted to comment on that. And I just wanted to feed into the HR element, because interestingly, Craig Scriven did touch on the shortlisting aspect. Now, in your document, John, and officers, on page 28, if you look down at the objectives, I'm just going down to it, everybody. You talked about quality objective 2 and actions. At the bottom of page 28, you've got here, Cabinet members will call out exclusionary behaviours by declining to participate in any public panels that do not include female and black, Asian, minority ethnic representation. I'm slightly concerned how that's worded and why you would decline to participate in anything that would cover all people, all qualities, everything. So I want you to just elaborate on that point, because I don't quite understand it. And going back to that point on the shortlisting, I have been in the JNC panel. I have been with Craig and other senior officers in those JNC panels, and very often, because Craig talked about fishing out of particular ponds, often you will get certain levels, particularly grade 7s, those that will only fit that criteria because they are the job spec for that job. You won't always be able to manage to pull 30 candidates in. It's just the way it is. And sometimes you go back out to tender, I know that, depending on the timelines you've got and the sort of urgency of filling the position. So I don't expect you to comment, but I'm just concerned that yes, we need to look at every aspect for all pay grades, but it's not always obvious. It's not always, we're not always able to do it as an organisation, is what I'm saying. We have to be very careful that when we do these types of works, we don't go completely the other end and say, well, that's going back out and we're not doing that because it doesn't fulfil that. There are certain people who do fit a job criteria and there are certain people that don't. And that's nothing to do with colour, race. It's just how it is. I'm slightly concerned about that, but I'm happy to talk to you, Craig, outside the meeting about that one. So can we just go back to that statement on the end of page 28?
So just take those in order. While I was trying to spare the poor reader of my extensive essay on the foibles and underpowered of English local government, which I could have gone on for some time about that. The point I was broadly trying to make was that actually local governments in this country does not have the range of discretion that you find in many other European or American cities. It certainly doesn't have the financial and budgetary flexibility and independence that we find elsewhere, simply because of the mechanisms by which local government is funded. And of course, we're creatures of statute, so we have limited discretion to do things that we might want to do if we are legally precluded from being able to do them. I think if you go to talk to other local authorities in other countries, there's a far greater devolution of power and budgetary responsibility. So that's the point I was trying to make, because essentially we are trying to address a really big economic and social agenda with a limited range of levers at our disposal. But what that isn't, which I think he then goes on to say, is an excuse for us not to do anything. So that's why this document is very much set around what are the things that we can do as ourselves, what are the things that we can do by marshalling the goodwill and support of partners. And also, I think the third part of this is being part of that ongoing dialogue with government nationally around the other powers and duties and resources that we need to be able to do more. So I think a really good example of this at the moment would be, and it does refer specifically to HCLG, the pilot that's taking place around exempt accommodation, where we've engaged in dialogue with governments about a specific, really big challenge in our city and said, look, we want to work with you on what does this look like, give us some resource so we can start to understand the extent of the problem, and then we will inevitably, I think, at the back of that, be pushing for further change to not only the legal and regulatory environment, but also the kind of powers that local government needs. So that was the point I was trying to make and capture in a sentence. So again, we collaborate with government despite our ideological differences on a whole range of issues. So we'll come on to some of that in the next presentation around City of Sanctuary and the work we've been doing around welcoming new arrivals to Birmingham as well. We are always reflecting on what good practice takes place elsewhere, and there's some real innovation that takes place right across the family of local government when it comes to equalities, and we've drawn on that. We've certainly had very good relationships, for instance, with Bristol, where there's some really interesting work that's been led by the Mayor and his cabinets there. We also are very patched into the Local Government Association family as well. We've been also involved in several cross-city projects around inclusive cities, some of which are sponsored through academic institutions. So we take what we're doing and we listen to what they're doing as well. And all of that will be used to inform it and develop the agenda as it goes forward. So I do think in some respects Birmingham is definitely leading the way on this, but there's always stuff that we can learn from others too, and I'm not going to be proprietary or exclusive about doing that.
Okay, I've got a couple of other people who
I didn't get an answer, Chair, to the paragraph at the bottom, page 29.
Yes, apologies. That's where I take the glasses off and can't read my own handwriting. With regard to current exclusionary behaviours, again, this is about us actually leading by example, I think, as politicians. And what we're saying there is we get invites to lots of external conferences organised by partner organisations, think tanks, you name it. And we've just taken the view that what we're not going to do is allow us is sit on panels where, bluntly, the entire panel looks like me. We've got... Make it that what we will. That's essentially what we're saying. We want to see panel. If we sit on a panel, we want to ensure that there are female voices heard on that panel, that there are voices from other diverse communities heard on that panel as well. I think it's that is just challenging other people's preconceptions and getting other organisations to think a little deeper about what they can do to bring forward different voices. And when you look at the composition and diversity of a city like Birmingham, if you can't find voices to sit on those panels that have something to say about whatever it is, whether it's housing, whether it's social care, whether it's transport, I'd argue you just haven't looked deeply enough. So we're just saying, as a point of practice, you know what, we want to encourage you to bring forward some different voices, so we won't participate if it is all white middle-aged men like me.
So as I was going to say, a couple of people have asked to ask supplementary, so I can cancel.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to sort of like follow up on the point made by Councillor Alden really, in regards to our older people. And this is because, I mean, I had a call yesterday from a very elderly resident who lives on a big complex for older people. And I was shocked to hear the state in which she was living through this big landlord. And in terms of, so some of these elderly people might not have any relatives that they can sort of call upon or have friends because they're very isolated. And I was shocked to see the level of bullying that she was being, that she was subjected to by the landlord. And I think this is sort of like your community safety role really for our elderly people, to understand what are we doing as a council to monitor some of the, we've got some older people residential complexes within the city, and how are we monitoring the state in which some of our elder people might be living, and to ensure that they are getting the services they're supposed to be getting. Because I've found out last night that this lady was being intimidated and bullied because this landlord had put a planning application in years ago, and she spoke up about the state in which she was living, and as a result, she's told me last night she's been living in this very, very difficult situation at home, where for years, and I'm talking about, she said about 6-7 years, she's not even had a cooker. So obviously I'm helping this lady, but as a council, I would like to know, what are we doing to ensure that our elderly residents are being looked after when they are in these large complexes, where they might be isolated, they might not know. I mean, she said she's recently found out about the private rented sector, but she never heard about them before. So they might not know about all these different departments within the council. So what are we doing to support those residents, and how are we checking up on them? And if we're not, is that something that we can look at?
I think you may well have given me an agenda item for a future staff chamber to check in with housing colleagues around some of that. And certainly I want to ensure that anything that's in terms of Birmingham City Council housing provision is very much aware of those challenges. It isn't allowing people to be isolated or bullied in any way. But we will take that away. And if you want to give me details in a specific case, I'm very happy to see what we can do to assist on that. Conscious that we have less power when it comes to private rented sector or perhaps a local form of housing provider. I think that probably touches on some of the comments that were made around exempt earlier on as well. And that's part of the reason why we've been pushing so hard for additional housing resources to deal with that. But if you want to give me specific details, then I'm very happy to follow that through.
It was just going to come in on that. Sorry, it's coming.
Yes, come on, if it's related.
Yeah, it is just to support that comment. If you go, just because you said you're going to do a star chamber about it. I had one very similar private rented accommodation. Guy, 68, when everyone out to cut his grass, his next door neighbour would come over because there was no fence between and just push him over because he didn't like him, cut his grass or something like that. He complained to the police. The police just said, I'm sorry, it's too low level. You need to go to your local council, etc. I couldn't really get any. They had to go quite higher. To try and get. I was lucky because I was doing the shadowing portfolio that I did, because I realised some of the people that I could speak to, and again when they're around the council, to speak to the individual, the person who answered the phone to someone who looks at council housing, and just said, no, sorry, this is council housing, I need to put the phone down, and I had to persuade them to ring back again. Because obviously I spoke to the department and they wanted to speak to him directly and say, can you just tell them to speak to the person who sits next to the person who's answering the phone, because they will be able to help them, and these are the things, and we're such a large organisation, we can't expect residents who are feeling intimidated to be able to find a way around it. Sorry, thank you, Carl, I really appreciate
it. Councillor Clements.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. If I may, I'd like to come back to the just the points that were made by John and Monica about the monitoring the impact of the Commonwealth Games. Again, I think I expect something more challenging there, because the theme of this document is about equity and where resources flow to those people who are suffering possible disadvantage. And I know we want the Games to be a success and want it to be a festival and a feel-good theme next year after this terrible period of pandemic. But at the moment, I think we've got a job on our hands to convince people that the resources are going to go and flow to the benefit of people who most need them. They're heavily concentrated in one area of the city. Clearly, that area needs regenerating, but it's not new. We need to show people that that impact is going to spread further. We've got the issue that the tickets are very, very expensive, for ordinary families, and we're on the brink of a period where we're going to be experiencing a lot more cuts to our budget. We know what's coming down the road for us in terms of a new period of austerity what the government is envisaging for council finances. So I really, again, I think it's good that we've got the engagement structures and we're going to listen and seek out the voices of diverse communities. But I think we need to actually track where the money is going, and then we need to look at the economic benefits on 2 years or 5 years. Because I'm just thinking about the London Olympics experience. What evidence is there, that part of East London, that it's really done anything to level up the economic fortunes of communities that live there? So I think, again, it's not just for John in your portfolio, it's for all of us in scrutiny, and all of us need to be challenging on that, because I can say that the Commonwealth Games are accelerating the progress on a lot of the transport schemes, so that's great, but we need to look at the long-term benefit of that and whether it is actually going to be a motor for inclusive economic growth as well. So I think we really need to be asking some serious questions there, because otherwise all of the other pressures that the Commonwealth Games are putting on our budget, particularly our revenue budget, are actually going to be to the detriment of our citizens.
I absolutely agree with you on this. I think we need to be thinking about how we put some tangible measurements and challenges in to do that. And I certainly think that this is, as you say, something that we can work very closely with scrutiny on. So I really welcome the kind of input and views from scrutiny colleagues. As you say, it cuts across all portfolios as well. So I think we need to be working together on what that basket of indicators and measures looks like. Certainly, these are issues I'm pursuing with the new head of inclusion and equality at the organising committee. But I think, again, this is something we've got to do some further work on right across the executive outskirts.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've had a really good first stab at this important issue. This vision I've got in my head, I've never heard of a Birmingham City Council described as a creature before. And I just have this image of this huge creature. It'll be a big creature, wouldn't it?
Have you seen the film The Thing? It came out sometimes the book.
But I imagine this big creature in indeterminate size and shape, fishing in several pools. And that's the image that I've got. I just want to end with, if you could all cast your mind back to the choir thing with Gareth Malone, can you remember? And I remember when Birmingham City Council choir was on, and he went around all the choir, the staff, and asked them what their jobs were. And it was absolutely, and he was stunned. Shows you how ignorant people who aren't involved with them can be of what we do. And he said, good heavens, he said, you're the glue that holds this city together. And that phrase, the glue that holds this city together, echoing what Councillor Mackey said, that if we get it wrong, it can quickly, end in unfortunate circumstances. So I think that's the glue looks pretty solid to me. It's holding. So thank you very, very much indeed. And you can't get away because you're dealing with the next item, which is very much uppermost in our minds with Afghanistan, with refugee dispersal around the UK, and how some authorities like Birmingham volunteered, others didn't. So what pressure does that put on us? And something that I hadn't taken into account, the Hong Kong situation, and more recently Afghanistan. So over to you on the City of Sanctuary.
Okay, thank you. I was worried when you mentioned the choir there, you're going to ask me to sing at the end. So
we always do. That's the first person to this committee has to sing.
Is that it? Right. It's absolutely fair.
I'm going to leave. I'm off.
I was just a volunteer.
Yeah, I think we'll get a professional musician after that. Great, okay. I know that there's been some slides that were circulated. Are we able to pull those up?
We are, yes.
Sorry, it's just depending on the speed.
Okay. Well, I'll take this. I'm going to introduce Bethany Finch, who's the commissioning manager for refugees and migration within the council. So this is more of a two-handed presentation. So I'm going to ask Bethany to talk us through some of the detail, but I'll provide a little bit of an overview to kick us off.
It's my luck, but we might be better start, and members have got it in the pack. Oh, okay.
There we go. Right. So what we're looking to do with this presentation is essentially do three things. So just recap a bit on where we are with the city policy statements we agreed 2018 to 22. Set out some of the progress that we made against the commitments that were in the City of Sanctuary policy statements. And then perhaps conclude just set out some of the issues around next steps. So this slide should come up as a recap of where we are so far. So I think as you mentioned at the outset, Chair, this is really pertinent we're doing this now. Birmingham has an incredibly long history of being a city of sanctuary, long before we ever adopted a statement to that effect. It's been a place of refuge and sanctuary for centuries, and I've often argued, I think it's in the city's DNA. You go up to the 17th century, and it was a place where people came to find refuge from the discrimination of their day, and it's something that came through from the English and beyond. And certainly, if I just reflect on the contents of my own inbox over the last few weeks since the situation's unfolded in Afghanistan, it's a view that's shared by the vast majority of people in the city as well. There's been a real outpouring of people who want to help, want to know what they can do, and provide that support. And that's not just organisations, that's individual citizens. And I think it speaks very powerfully to the commitment we've made. So we move on to the next slide. There we go. Right. So back in 2015, we formally declared ourselves to be a city of sanctuary. You might remember that coincided with the Syrian vulnerable persons relocation scheme. Birmingham gave a commitment to house 550 people under that resettlement scheme at the time. But we also lined it up with the declaration of the city of sanctuary. A couple of years later, that was then reinforced by a position statement that kind of fleshed out what our approach would be. And then at the beginning of 2019, I think it was literally 3 weeks before I took on this portfolio, full council approved the City of Sanctuary full policy statements, which includes 12 specific commitments. We move on to the next slide.
There's a little bit of a delay.
That's okay, fine. There we go, wonderful. So just to recap on what's in that statement, so it's made up of the 12 commitments, but there's kind of three things that underpin it, those three balls in the glass there. So firstly, it's recognises that this is a broader migrant population that's beyond simply refugees and asylum seekers in the city. That statement also picked up on the role that the important role that EU migrants play within Birmingham as well. And it was trying to get a more inclusive definition of what we meant by sanctuary, so just beyond the initial issues around asylum and refugees. We then said it's about from moving people from surviving to actually thriving in Birmingham. So this is about not just dealing with crisis. We know that people who arrive, particularly refugees in Birmingham, are facing all sorts of immediate challenges. And it is a matter of survival from, roof over your head to where's your dinner coming from. But what we want to do is move beyond that to how we create a platform to enable people to build lives and opportunities here. So that was very much sort of written into this statement. What are the things that we can do to move people beyond crisis, get them settled, and then enable them to participate as full citizens of Birmingham. And the third bit to doing that was recognising the role of assets as well as the needs that people present with. If you go around and talk to migrants and refugees in this city, you just be bowled over by the amazing wealth of experience they've got, the skills that they brought with them. And there's real potential there to be unlocked. In addition to the kind of communities that are already here, that have welcomed new arrivals. So this is very much about, how do we make qualifications transferable? How do we enable people to innovate, develop new skills, and so on. So we move on to the next slide. As I said, the full statement contains 12 commitments, but what we tried to do is make it a little bit easier to present this morning by grouping them into these 6 themes. The commitments are actually detailed in full in the written report if you want to see what the specific commitments are, but we want to touch on 6 areas. So this is about how we make Birmingham a genuine place of welcome, how we're working with our stakeholders and our partners to deliver on this agenda, some of the work that we're doing around awareness and access to services, so helping people to navigate their way through what can often be a quite complex system. Talk a little bit about the specific challenges that we've been addressing along with our partners. Then talk about how we really celebrating the work that's been done, taking pride in the achievements that we've made together, and also increasing understanding, breaking down some of the misconceptions that often sit around this agenda. And finally, about how we're embedding and mainstreaming some of this work going forward. So what I'm going to do now, if that's okay, is hand over to Bethany, who will take you through some of the detail of each of these 6 themes, and then we'll pick up with the next steps and then some questions and discussion. So over to you, Bethany.
Good morning, everyone. Because it's morning. If we could go to this slide. So first of all, I'll just talk a little bit of the progress that we've made on this first theme, a place of welcome. And the place of welcome theme really captures the commitments that we made as a council under commitment 8. So that's a commitment to be open and transparent in our plans and approaches for essentially welcoming people to Birmingham. So Councillor Cotton's already mentioned, back in 2015, we made a pledge to resettle 550 Syrian refugees. Since then, we've added to that and pledged as well to welcome 110 refugees of different nationalities under something called the UK Resettlement Scheme. We are also a local authority in which government places destitute asylum seekers in dispersed accommodation. We're a local authority that participates in the National Transfer Scheme and welcomes unaccompanied asylum seeking children. And a couple of things have been added to this since the commitment itself was made. So the EU settlement scheme has been launched, so that's in there as well. The new Hong Kong British National Overseas Visa Group has also been launched, and very recently the Afghan relocation scheme for Afghan interpreters has also been launched. So those are the things that I'll pick up here. So in terms of our commitment to Syrian resettlement, we have now welcomed 516 refugees under that 550 pledge. We couldn't reach 550 because unfortunately the last flight of Syrian refugees due to arrive in the city coincided with the outbreak of COVID back in March 2020. So international travel just got completely stopped and paused for quite an extended period in terms of Home Office resettlement. And by the time things were restarted, government had met their 20,000 national pledge, so it was no longer possible for us to welcome those final 34 individuals who are missing from our 550 pledge. That's one of the largest numbers of refugees that a local authority has welcomed under that scheme. I think we're second only to Coventry and Bradford, who are both local authorities who started welcoming people on that scheme pretty much the day it was launched. They're very early adopters of the scheme. In terms of our kind of follow-on resettlement pledge, so I mentioned we back in Cabinet at March 2020, I think Cabinet agreed that we would welcome 110 refugees from different nationalities, still as it happened, focusing on the kind of Middle East, North Africa region, but the intention was that it would be a global scheme. And Birmingham City Council pledged to welcome 110 people on that scheme. Unfortunately, that scheme has been really affected by the ongoing international travel situation and arrivals from red countries. And we have only been able to welcome 16 people in, I think, four families on that scheme. So it got going shortly. It was due to be launched during the kind of COVID period. So it's been slow progress on that scheme nationally. We continue to support the systems and providers working in the city, contracted by government to support destitute asylum seekers who are dispersed here under sections 95 and section 4 of the Immigration and Asylum Act. Birmingham at any one time has or hosts between it seems at the moment it seems to be between around 1,300 and 1,500 asylum seekers in dispersed accommodation. I think the latest Midlands who has requested that government pause dispersing new asylum or procuring new accommodation for asylum seekers in Birmingham so that we can use the period to constructively work with government to resolve some of the issues that we face on that scheme. In addition, we continue to welcome children, both children who spontaneously arrive in the city as unaccompanied asylum seeking children, and also those who are referred to us by the national mechanism for kind of fair distribution, which is called the National Transfer Scheme. And those children are supported by the Children's Trust as children in care and care leavers. In terms of the EU settlement scheme, so this is a slightly different one to fall into this commitment because it's not about people arriving in the UK, it's about ensuring that those who are here remain here and continue to be able to access their rights beyond Brexit and beyond the end of the grace period, which is now finished. We've done quite a lot of work around this. We've been hosting for the last 2.5 years a working group with key stakeholders in the city. And we've also since October 2020 been accessing grant funding from the Home Office to be able to provide a little bit more resource on this topic in the city. So through that we funded half a post within the council for coordination purposes. We funded some administrative support in the Children's Trust so that they can ensure that children who are of EU nationality are registered, and funding some third sector immigration advice agencies in the city so that they can focus on outreach and engagement and ensuring that people with complex needs can access that in terms of the EU settlement scheme. So the national figures, there's always a lag in them, and we don't have any figures other than what the Home Office publishes. Going back to March 2021, 116,260 people have made applications for the scheme in Birmingham. Of those, 106,000 are concluded. And that's against our working estimate for the EU migrant population in Birmingham of 94,000. But I should note that the Home Office publishes figures on applications rather than applicants. And if you're familiar with the EU settlement scheme, for some people it is a two-stage process. So there could well be some double counting in there. And nationally, there have been over 6 million applications. It's already been referred to the UK government's announcement back in January of the new visa route to the UK for Hong Kong nationals who hold British national overseas status. This is a slightly it's different in many ways from other schemes. So it's not a resettlement scheme in that a local authority will decide to welcome this many people and will be kind of closely involved with the welcome of those people. It's a visa scheme, so anyone who is successful in getting that visa can choose to live in the UK where they want, how they want, as most people who live here are able to. We do know that we are expected to be one of the cities in the UK that sees the biggest increase in its population through this scheme, and that's largely because of our existing Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese population in the city and the community networks that provides people with, the familiarity, all those sorts of things that generally kind of guide people's migration choices. We've been doing quite a lot of planning and preparation around the new arrivals that this visa route may bring. We've been preparing a welcome pack, which will be available on the Birmingham City Council website We've been working with the school's admissions team because I think it seems to be that for those moving, education and early access to education is a really kind of key priority. We've been working with other stakeholders as well around starting to unblock some of those longer term challenges, so particularly around housing and not having credit history in the UK that just means that people face barriers in terms of being able to live independently. And I'm sure there's more. We're working as well with two kind of regional, well, one national and one regional body who are imminently appointing regional kind of coordinators on the Hong Kong B&O visa route as well. So I expect that this work will really pick up kind of in the next quarter as those post holders are in place. I will now just talk about the efforts to support the Afghan refugee crisis. So back in May, we were approached by the government to make a commitment to a scheme which has actually been around since 2013, the Afghan Interpreters Relocation Scheme, sometimes called ARAP, which offers relocation and protection to Afghan nationals who've been working with British troops in Afghanistan as interpreters or other employees and their family members. So Birmingham has pledged to welcome 80 individuals, and the idea is that those people will arrive before the end of September. We do seem to be on track for that. So as of today, 26 people have arrived in the city already into Birmingham homes. Many more are already in the UK in temporary accommodation and are just waiting for their Birmingham homes to become vacant or ready for their occupation. So we've matched more than that for properties, and it's still our expectation and hope that those people will be in their Birmingham homes by the end of September. Alongside the Afghan Interpreters Relocation Scheme, we continue to support government with, as we can and as needed, with the various efforts to evacuate people from Afghanistan, and that has included use of Birmingham Airport and some of the Birmingham hotel quarantine facilities. So I think if we go on to the next slide, so this slide is quite another broad one. It covers off commitments 6, 7 and 8, which all get to how we work with our partners and stakeholders. That's thing 2. So this is locally within Birmingham, how we work with our statutory, voluntary and community sector colleagues, also regionally and nationally, and how we ensure that stakeholders have a voice in terms of being able to influence programmes of work that fall under the city, essentially policy heavy. So I'll just talk about some of these forums and networks for a little while. First of all, we've got the Birmingham Migration Forum, which continues and has continued despite digital meetings to grow. We now have, I think, over 220 email addresses on our Birmingham Migration Forum. It's a network that the council now hosts and chairs, and it gives people an opportunity to engage on a kind of thematic or issue by issue basis. And understand what the latest developments are, to get the right kind of information to connect across the sector. Yesterday we held a meeting on housing and how people can navigate both the social housing and the private rented housing markets. And we've also previously had meetings on, for example, the council's digital inclusion work, and allowed people to kind of reflect on what those plans were at the time that they were still being developed, and have a voice and influence some of what we're doing as a council on a broader basis that way. A few projects have come out of this forum. So 2 examples that I'd just like to give. One is a strategic needs assessment of migration, which was commissioned earlier this year and is due to be complete by January 2022. So that came out of discussions that happened at the Birmingham Migration Forum around access to data and insights and intelligence around what our migrant population in Birmingham actually looks like beyond just the publicly available statistics. And the second is something called BARMS, you can see a little screenshot there, which stands for the Birmingham Asylum, Refugee and Migration Services. And it's a website that we monitor. And it's essentially an online directory of all services in Birmingham that provide or have an offer for newly arrived communities in the city. So it's a way both for those organisations to know who else is working in the field, but also it's set up so that refugees and migrants themselves can search for a service that they may need and find it in their own language as well. The City Sanctuary Partnership Board is something that Councillor Cotton chairs, and this is our more strategic stakeholder partnership board, essentially, that is now, as of 2020, is very closely aligned to the City Sanctuary Policy Statement. So the forward plan for this board is thematically delivered as this report has been. We also continue with our working groups, for example, kind of aligned to specific work programmes so that key stakeholders, whether they're commission providers or other stakeholders in the city, can input and influence what we're doing as council, and so that we can work in partnership. And we continue to play a kind of an active role in all the regional networks that are generally come together under the West Midlands Strategic Migration Partnership. And we've also, in the last 6 months, been a founding member of the Cities of Sanctuary Local Authority Network, which is a national network. So we'll move on to the next slide.
Definitely. This is going to be the third of 6 themes, and you've already had about 15, 20 minutes. I'm just, if you could just focus on the key things that you think you may be. It's a great presentation. I'm just conscious it's a second of 2 big issues, and I'm just conscious we need to have time for discussion afterwards. So,
is that okay? Yeah.
So if you could just focus on the key issue.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of awareness and access to rights and services, there's lots in the report, but I will just focus on one project to give an example of what this can look like. So the Foundation for Integration project has been around since early 2020 and actually is a predecessor of a previous project. It's 18 months of investment by the EU that provides move on information for newly granted asylum route refugees, so that they don't fall into crisis at the point that they're asked to leave home office accommodation. So it includes advice across housing and welfare, employment, language, community connections, all those sorts of things. It also provides an information and advice pathway for non-EU migrants, and really focuses on those areas of advice where immigration is really key in terms of being able to access other services. It also offers training for frontline staff, operates our own Birmingham City Council neighbourhood advice and information services. And at the moment, we are commissioning a web portal to be able to facilitate exchange of information on those topics. And then on to the next slide. So the theme 4 is regarding focusing on tackling specific challenges with partners. So there are 2 commitments 4 and 5, which reflect on what are really important areas of work within the kind of migration and integration area. So those are health and employment and enterprise. And again, I think here we've just got 2 examples on this, or just one example on this slide. This is just a project, it's a project that was linked to the Migrant Cities initiative in 2020, where 18 community health champions were trained. And they all come from different migrant backgrounds, so different nationalities, different languages represented, different experiences of migration to the UK. Some have been here a really long time, and some were still in that initial settlement period. They received training on basic and universal public health messaging. That included things like the availability of services, how people can register with the GP, the fact that the GP is the kind of front door of the NHS, what people's rights and entitlements look like, and debunking some of those myths that lots of different communities have about how the health system works in the UK. And this was a really successful project, a really useful project to actually have launched just before COVID hit, and formed a really early part of the Community Champions Network attached to the COVID-19 response, and they were well linked in with Birmingham City Council Public Health Team as well. I will move on to the next slide. So the penultimate theme is taking pride in what we stand for and increasing understanding. So again, 2 commitments that fall under this, commitments 1 and 11. Some of this is around celebrating what we're doing. Some of this is around ensuring that awareness is raised and that people have access to training and use it. So in terms of celebrating what we're doing, we work very closely with the city stakeholders around Refugee Week every year. And there are 2 examples from recent Refugee Weeks in the report. Awareness raising. Various projects have given us the opportunity over the last few years to provide training across the council and externally, whether that's from within my team or from working in partnership with some of the key agencies in the city. So, for example, we provided some basic training for children's social workers, adult social care staff, housing and neighbourhood teams and schools admissions. And then the city sanction policy also gives us a voice in terms of being able to work with stakeholders to escalate key issues that we feel need resolving in this area to remove some of the barriers that people face when they settle here. So there's also some examples of that in the report. And then on to the last theme, embracing, embedding and mainstreaming. So this is, or could have been by far the biggest bit of the report. This is essentially how we as a council, beyond just a refugees and migration team of 7 people in adult social care commissioning, how we embody that message of welcome, but also of ensuring that people can continue to access services and thrive and live independently, regardless of their migration background in Birmingham. So some examples of how this is done in the report, and there are many other examples across the council of where this is being done. It's just that we couldn't collate it all for the report. And on the next 2 slides, I think there are 2 examples of how this has been done really nicely. So this first example here, celebrating sanctuary project, and then the next slide was about a project in libraries where staff have received training, have been doing outreach with voluntary sector groups that support refugees, and have been offering kind of welcome sessions at libraries, and are now also pursuing becoming a library of sanctuary. So that actually concludes the update on the themes, and then the next steps are back over to Councillor.
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. I think you get a sense there just of the breadth and depth of activity that's taking place. So just to be really quick, so there's time for question and discussion. 3 next steps. Firstly, we're just looking at addressing the gaps that we know that are still there. So there's certainly with regards to a joint pathway towards employment and self-employment. There's work we want to do in that space, and also some work to get better data capture and intelligence, particularly around skills and aspirations amongst new arrivals. Further progress that we need to make around awareness raising, including some of the stuff around our staff. And then finally, we want to enhance the existing statement. So we are revising the statement over the next year. We're looking at some new commitments that go in there. There's certainly some stuff around housing that we know we need to include. I think we also need to strengthen the position around those with no recourse to public funds, which has become a really serious, well, it's always been a serious issue, but I think a very prominent issue as a result of COVID. And of course, there's been wider experience that we've had as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the fallout from Afghanistan, that we want to incorporate in that as well. So I hope that's given you something of a flavour of what we've been trying to do in this space. But, thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. I'm sorry I hurried you up, Bethany. Just that councillors don't like being too long of a presentation, because we're all keen to participate. That's why we're here. But I think it's an excellent report and an excellent presentation. I just wanted to pay tribute. I did the last time I did any scrutiny around this was on no recourse to public funds. I don't know whether any members were involved with that with me back in 2013, I think. And there was a bit of a siege mentality of them and us. It was the voluntary sector groups who were looking after the interests of people with no recourse, particularly children. And the number of injunctions that we were getting for perceived lack of support was incredible. And we suggested, we didn't make a long list of recommendations, which is unusual for a scrutiny committee. We just tried to get the two sides to build relationships and to stop hitting each other with baseball bats, metaphorically, and to work collaboratively in the interests of the people that we were both trying to help. And it seems to me that simple message has got through, and there's much more of a partnership approach now, which shines through from the presentation and the examples that you've given to illustrate how it's working in practice. So I think it's a model of how you can turn things around from, something that's conflict into collaboration. So I praise you for turning that around. Councillor Mackey.
Thanks very much, Carl, and thanks very much for the presentation. It's great to see an officer who sort of lives and breathes their subjects, so thanks very much for that. The question I was going to ask was, there was reference made there to the Syrian Brummies. I was lucky enough to meet them on a couple of occasions, and it was an interesting, as you'd expect, they were quite a mixed group, and they had some challenges. They arrived with nothing. Linguistically, there was one guy there who operated pretty much as the interpreter for the whole group. But as you move through the group, some of their English was kind of non-existent, and the fact their emotional turmoil. I think quite a number of the families were spread across Europe. Some of them didn't even know where they were, so they didn't even know if they'd actually got to Europe. Highly qualified, I think, as Councillor Cotton said earlier on, but of course you don't always leave with your full qualification documentation. So you arrive at a hospital and say, I'm fully qualified surgeon, obviously not going to give you a scalpel and tell you to crack on. So I mean, these things aren't easy for them. And I was just wondering, because I mean, one of the guys, the guy's interpreter, I think, when he quickly got onto the employment ladder, I think he got a job as a bus driver, then he was working for Barclays Bank, I think, and I think then he moved on somewhere else again. And but I was just wondering how much experience we were taking from that, and actually what happened to those individuals, because I say I've lost contact with them, I haven't heard anything of them for a while. I'm just wondering how they were faring. No, thanks very much.
Yes, so we've been resettling people under that scheme since 2015, and every family that arrives is entitled to 5 years of support from the local authority. We provide that in the first year through a kind of accommodation, orientation and early integration service. And then we have 5 commission services that we call our years 2 to 5 provision. So it's grouped in that way in recognition that integration journeys aren't kind of linear, and lots of people will want to access different services at different points. So one of those services does focus on employability. And I'd say of our services, that's the one that's been most affected by the last year. Lots of people who had recently got into work at that stage were faced with challenges on the employment market, as lots of people in the UK have been. Those sorts of quite insecure appointments. So I think of the original group that arrived, because we had I think one quite large arrival back in 2015-16, and then a bit of a pause in our resettlement activity before the rest of the cohort arrived. And I think that group quite quickly formed a close network, and were able to support each other, and that actually gave us that formed the basis of one of our other commissioning intentions that actually never materialised, and we provided it through a different way, which is to provide monthly community day sessions for our Syrian families in Birmingham. So recognising how important it is for people to have a place to come together and share experiences, and that actually sometimes finding that strength from within your own community can also translate to how people get to know other parts of the city and just build that confidence. And have that shared experience. So it's been online over the last year. I think in September or October, we hope to hold our first in-face community day, but those have been happening on a monthly basis for the last couple of years, where people get together and it's a kind of whole family day of fun.
Yeah, that's good. So I think if I remember right, I think we first met in a park, and that was a Methodist church, I think, gave them a hall to use, and so they got it sort of established that way around. So, I mean, they haven't had it easy at all, have they, really?
No, and there wasn't a large Syrian community in Birmingham before our families arrived. So that was quite a different experience as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was a very impressive presentation. It's very obvious that we're doing a lot to support families from on board and asylum seekers. I work in the DV sector, as you may or may not be aware, and I often struggle to find out what support we give. I know that you're saying that we support members from the EU that come abroad, but when we have people who come here on either a spousal or a family visa from EU, it would be good to understand. And obviously, I'm saying that I work in that sector, but also I'm sure for other councillors as well, to understand how we support them and what support they're entitled to, and also low recourse to public funds. In the past, I've tried to find out how we can support individuals who might be in an abusive relationship, who might have no recourse to public funds because they don't have permanent status here, and they are dependent on their spouse who visa to stay in this country as far as they're aware. So it would be good to understand how we support those individuals and what their rights are when they're in Birmingham, because quite often what I've had to do, I've had to look elsewhere to try and get them housed, accommodation or support, especially if they haven't got a child, because I know if there's a child involved, they then get some entitlements to support the child because they're a duty of care for the child. But I'd like to understand how we support those individuals who might be in abusive relationships and might be from the EU or might be having no recourse to public funds.
So I can say a little bit about how we support with domestic violence projects in terms of our commission services for the refugees that we work with. I'll do that first, and then I'll come to the broader issue. Of those that we work with directly, so mainly our resettled refugees in the city, domestic violence has come up as an issue, quite a small one, I'm pleased to say, but it's an issue, and it's a broader issue than just the incidence of violence itself as well. Conflated with or compounded by the migration experience, where families go through a lot of change, and the role of the kind of head of the household changes, and people's rates of integration are different, and just that dynamic within the household can really shift. So for that specific reason, we have actually provided a grant to an organisation who is specifically focused on the issues of domestic violence in the context of new migration or new resettlement, and they're delivering a broader programme of family kind of therapy. So working with a whole household. So it's not, we're not talking at the point around where a household falls apart. It's kind of a more preventative measure. So that's one of the things we're doing in that area in terms of our commission services. more broadly, I think for the group that you mentioned, so family members of visa holders in Birmingham, that's not the group that we, at least in my team, work directly with. So I think that's probably something that will fall under the domestic abuse agenda. We have worked closely with the teams working on that commissioning programme, and especially, as you mentioned, the links around immigration advice and access to that advice at the right time, so that people understand that they can often access status on their own right, not just dependent on an abusive partner. So some of what we've been doing has been ensuring that the trusted immigration advice providers or third sector agencies that we work with on migration issues are also linked into the kind of broader domestic abuse agenda and those commission providers.
I think this is something we'll come back to, as I refer to, strengthening some of the pathways and that next steps piece. So certainly there's a crossover between both parts of my portfolio there with regards to the work Bethany's team is doing in the wider domestic abuse agenda. So we'll certainly be picking up that as part of that work going forward. Again, yeah, very happy to have a further conversation about that.
Councillor Pocock.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Very briefly, you've reported very thoroughly on the formalised channels, if you like, by which people arrive into the city. But we were given a shocking statistic at the Health Scrutiny Committee by Justin Barney, who said it looks like there are something like 80,000 people living in Birmingham that nobody knew were there. They're popping up because they're walking to the walking vaccination centres. So suddenly somebody arrives, they're not done it, no name, any NHS number, no NI number, no register, not on benefits. They're living in the cash economy. And the size of this population, if you have migrated to the city, if you like, under the radar, often you like secondary routes, is evidently massive. And I know Justin wants to draw attention to this, but it strikes me that your strategy is to add an additional strand in there to try and pick up people who have often been recent migrants to the UK, work their way around informally. They desperately do not want to come to the attention of the Home Office because the hostile environment policy is driven people below the radar, but the size of this group and the needs they have is massive and in large part invisible. I wonder if your vision here could be enhanced by this has very recently come to light in the vaccination program experimenting funny stuff including this, but it strikes me there's some work really rapidly needing to be done to find a way of engaging with those communities who desperately don't want to be made visible to official them, but nevertheless obviously are citizens living here with needs, rights and demands.
And consequently they're easily exploited.
Absolutely, often they're living in exactly that field.
Housing, jobs.
All sorts of marginal
And I don't know if Bethany wants to add anything on this, but certainly that was my point in that as we're refreshing and revisiting the strategy, that whole issue around that population's been largely invisible, overwhelmingly have no recourse to public funds, has been very brutally exposed again by COVID. So as I said, Justin's brought that figure to attention through the vaccination centres. We knew earlier on when we were dealing with the Everybody In strategy to deal with those who are sleeping on the street. Again, we're having people who are coming forward because they're essentially leaving the hidden economy because of the lockdown and everything else. So we certainly want to look at how we find ways of engaging in an effective, appropriate way with those individuals. And looking at what resources we have to be able to address some of those concerns. But I think there's also a bit here around wider national lobbying as well, because I think we really need to fundamentally think again about the no recourse to public funds condition and what that means. Again, going back to what levers we have and what levers we don't, this isn't a lever that we have in our hands, but we're certainly dealing with the consequences of the current policy environment, so that does need to change.
Councillor Harman.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I mean, a large portion of this comes from that period of migration policy when there was no system of checking people out of the system as they left, which we brought in, well, why are we worried about registering people in the same league? Of course, the reason why you should be is if you don't register one league, you don't really be able to stay as well. And there's a very, very significant, I mean, I'm aware through personal experience that there almost certainly take very large population of Jamaican nationals in this city are coming to that category, people who came here legally on tourist visas, just didn't go home. And similarly, I'm sure that applies to several other nationalities. And I'm not at all surprised by the figure that Councillor Pocock paid. So that clearly is important. I just wanted to pick up on the figures you gave for the EU settlement scheme. So there's a gap in those figures of 10,000 between those people who've applied and those people who've been given their status. My question is that simply that's how far the process has gone, and those 10,000 will just go through that process in a few weeks, they'll get their status? Or is it that there's 10,000 who won't get their status, and what will then happen to them? So are there questions, problems, and are we likely therefore to get issues out of that with 10,000 people who have to go or whatever? So just an understanding of what's going on there. And given, I mean, that also indicates, you said there may be some other double counting, but again, the population is significantly larger than we thought. Is that all taken into account by that double counting, or is that genuinely the case? That's not my main question.
So firstly, on the gap between applications and concluded applications made and concluded applications, I think that the majority of that will just be processing time on the Home Office's part. We've quite consistently monitored that all the way through the statistics since they've been released. And the Home Office made vast improvements during the initial COVID lockdown periods where no one was really submitting applications, but they were able to catch up with the backlog that they had on the system. So that was where the gap was the lowest. And since then, it's just widened even more, and especially as we've been getting closer to that June the 30th deadline, which was for many people a really important deadline on submitting an application to EUSS. So for the most part, it will just be a processing gap on the Home Office's part, and people are likely to get an outcome of some. We do hear that some people don't get the status granted in the way that either that they applied for, if they applied for full settled status rather than unsettled, or that an application is refused on the basis of some complicated immigration matter, like a document or proof of residence over a period. So that does happen. I suppose that's why it's important for us as a city to make sure that people are able to access advice as and when they need it, because usually, we've seen that the right advice from a trusted provider can make all the difference in those sorts of examples. There was a second part to your question, which was just about the size of the EU migrant population in Birmingham, I think. So the figure of 94,000 is a guiding figure, but what it doesn't include is family members of EU nationals who are eligible for the EU settlement scheme, but wouldn't fall within that 94,000. So there's always a 94,000 plus in our minds in terms of the working estimate. So 94,000 individuals plus family members who may be entitled to apply for the scheme. So I think, and that's the case nationally with figures that government have been using to estimate there for the national EU population, and the case locally. Unfortunately, there's just no data that can give us a more accurate estimate from that.
So just quickly ask that mean family members who are children of, or do you mean relatives who are entitled to but aren't currently here?
Yeah, so third country nationals. So for example, it could be a Dutch citizen who's an EU migrant in the UK but has a Somali wife. So that person has a Somali passport, doesn't come up as on our kind of EU statistics, but their right to reside in the UK is dependent on their their family member, their husband.
Councillor Clement.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quickly to come back to some of the points that Councillor Cotton was making about the need to get some national body on this, because I noted page 9 of the report, the issue of the quality of the accommodation that the government is commissioning for asylum seekers that are beginning their claim. I think that became a particular issue in the pandemic, and that this accommodation is being commissioned from G4S in this region, and I just think that we need to stop setting a higher expectation of the quality of that accommodation, and also be aware of the impact on the communities. And then the other concerns that we talked about in the dispersal scheme, I think it's become very apparent that actually, although it's a national scheme, the number of people being dispersed in it is disproportionately higher in the Midlands than the North. So I think with the current Afghan situation, again, are we making representations to government about that, and what sort of response are we getting? Thank you.
Some important stuff. It's Serco now that one of the many changes that they've been through. We have had real concerns about how that asylum dispersal contract has operated, and that's with two regards. To say, firstly, in terms of the quality of accommodation and support, and we made repeated representations, both at officer and political level, around that. I think it's fair to say it's had limited impact, but I'm not sure how receptive some of the ears have been to some of the things we've been trying to put across. And we certainly, during the COVID lockdowns, had real concerns about how some of these places were genuinely COVID compliant, and public health are very closely involved in challenging that and advising Serco on the pitfalls. There's been another issue which has been around the extent to which we've been subject to any meaningful engagement and consultation around the standing up of so-called contingency accommodation. So at the moment we have two standing initial accommodation facilities within Birmingham, which are managed by Serco, and then there is the dispersed accommodation that Bethany referred to on top of that. But what we've then seen, because of pressures that have been arising in the system during the lockdown in particular, Serco essentially standing up hotel accommodation at very short notice as contingency. Our concerns about that twofold. One, we've just not been properly engaged or advised. Literally, it's kind of a phone call into the council saying, by the way, we're doing this with sometimes hours' notice, which is clearly not acceptable, because there's a whole set of other things that we want to do to provide support to people, and also considering the wider impact of a decision like that. So we're very, very critical around that, and this is not something that's just confined to Birmingham alone. The other metropolitan authorities in our region have had similar issues, and we continue to challenge and raise that with the Home Office. So that has been a real problem for us. The other problem with contingency is previous experiences show that short-term contingency frequently is nothing but a source. We've had situations in this city where people have been put into contingency accommodation hotels, what's supposed to be a matter of weeks at most, and we're seeing them still there several months later. And there's been many robust conversations and challenges around that as well. So we continue to make those representations and challenge over the quality of the support that's provided, and also the system as it works at the moment. And I think there'll be more to come on that as we work with our partners across the region. The other thing that we've been saying to government is, we've been very happy to be an active participant in dispersal scheme. We see it as integral to our role as a city of sanctuary, but there are other parts of the country that have not stepped up in the same way. And this is a national responsibility. I think it's incumbent on government to work with those other authorities that haven't stepped forward in the same way to see what they can do to help as well. This is never going to be a place that wants to shut its door on people in need, but we also have to accept that there are challenges that come with just in resource terms, as well as issues around quality accommodation. So that's why we've been pushing so hard on that, and we'll continue to do so. Then I think the other thing, and the slide was up earlier on around the ban campaign. Again, the need to change those broader national policies. We passed that resolution, I think 2 years ago now, was it, around supporting the Lift the Ban campaign, ending the situation where asylum seekers are waiting sometimes years for a decision, completely economically excluded and able to work and have to subsist on £5.66 a day. So again, we need that kind of policy change as part of this as well.
Yes, briefly on.
Just a supplementary, if I may, I was very interested to see in the report the reference to the work that's going on ESOL and the partnership arrangements that will be accepted. But I know that over the last decade or so, the national funding for ESOL has actually been drastically reduced. And I noted from what you were talking about with the Syrian migrant group that there's quite a diverse range of English language. And a lot of people are going to need a lot of support. And if we're thinking about Afghan citizens coming in, in a sense that English language competence is the key to integrating, being part of the community in Birmingham and being able to work when it's legal, when they can work. So what are the perspectives for future funding of that? Are we going to see an expansion in the light of what's happening at the moment, particularly with Afghan refugees?
Bethany may have a little bit more detail on that, but I think we're certainly still trying to understand what the range of support is likely to be. There's been this great outpouring of sort of like desire to help and support from citizens and organisations in Birmingham, but I don't think what we've got is that clarity yet around what kind of national support packages might be put in place to address issues like that. But Bethany, if you've got anything specific on the ESOL, please.
Yeah, I just make a comment that it often seems the way in this area of work that pots of funding do decrease, but they also just change. So while one funding stream may stop, there may be funding that materialises in different ways. So recognising that, going back, I think, a year or so, we have actually used some of the money that we received as a local authority for resettling the Syrian refugee cohort to commission our own Birmingham adult education services to provide something called the ESOL Hub, which is a project that started in April this year and will run for 3 years. So that's quite a large investment that we've made using a chunk of the resettlement money. And the idea is that it will, of course, be a service that can be accessed by our resettled refugees, but also support the welcoming environment in Birmingham more broadly. So it's going to be, I think, Birmingham Adult Education Services have already commissioned a website developer, so there will be an online ESOL hub, and it will also include various pathways from informal community-based ESOL provision, non-accredited, through to accredited, formal, including things like the IELTS test, which are needed for people to go into higher education, some NHS employment pathways. So that's one of the ways that it will provide a kind of holistic service for ESOL in the city. It's a 3-year project because it needs to be. There's a lot going on in the city in terms of ESOL, but something that really coordinates it and brings it all together will take 3 years to materialise.
Can I understand why? I know I'm aware of the time it's very, but just on the ESOL provision for children, because I think is there anything specifically targeted or any funding that's going to go to schools to support language and acquisition for children? Because I think there's assumption that children will actually pick up the language. Actually, again, to succeed in the school system, they need help.
It varies per scheme. So on the refugee resettlement schemes, schools are entitled to receive a certain level of funding per child, depending on their age, that goes to their school. And we work through us. So in my team, we work with the schools to understand how they can best use that funding to support children in their schools. Sometimes it ranges from things like school uniform to having a dedicated member of staff in the room to support that child. We are working with other parts of the council that have responsibility for English as an additional language in schools. I know that there is a training offer that is available, and we connect schools to that offer as well. On the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Programme, one of the grants that we've made over the last couple of years is to a company that's developed an English app to use in the classroom. And the schools that have been resettling refugees will have a free license for that app so that they can use that digitally assisted as well.
Final is Councillor Afghan.
Thanks, Chair. Just on the Afghan scenario, I'm sure other members or elected members within inner cities were inundated with calls from relatives whose children and parents and partners are actually out there really worried on what's happening. What sort of information can we pass on? I know at the moment I'm referring it to our local MP who's helping out, you know, that they've got the workers. But is there any guidelines where we can direct them other than the local MPs? And just touching on the ESOL, we've got a number of organisations within the city, private, who run ESOL classes, and you know, Dolphin Centre in my ward is a classic example where, you know, people join as their English not being their first language, virtually no English whatsoever. And I've gone there 12 months later, 18 months later to present to the church. They're actually standing doing presentations in English. So there's some fantastic work that's being done out there. And I think that at government level, that they need more support. Thanks, yeah.
So on the first question, in fact, how Birmingham citizens can support their family members. There are two helplines that have been shared with us by government. One of them is for British nationals who are in Afghanistan, and the other is for Afghan nationals who are still in Afghanistan. So we can share them with members.
What I think we'll do is make sure that's shared around the council again. I know I shared a note some weeks ago around the support arrangements, but that is essentially what we've got. So we'll make sure that goes around as well. Thank you.
And then finally, on your ESOL point, part of what the ESOL Hub will do is map all those different types of provision in the city as well. So it's not about just replacing something like that is working well within its trusted community environment. It's just about creating the links between that so that people can supplement their learning in other ways.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. One of the things that often strikes me as having represented an inner city ward for nearly well over 30 years, if I was to go through my Advice Bureau case records, I could probably, if I had my memory erased, I would know where the major conflicts of the world or major issues of the world are, because I will know from which part of the world people are coming and looking for help. So it's the point I'm making is that this isn't, whilst there are particular pressures now, this city has always been a city that welcomes people who come here for whatever reason, usually fear of war, poverty, and victimisation, discrimination. But I think that's something that we can, as a city council and as individual councillors and citizens, something that we can be very, very proud of. And I think, Bethany, I always have who's important in the city council is if they were hit by a bus, would we be able to cope? And I have to say, if you have a list. If you were hit by a bus, Bethany, I do not know how we would manage to fill that obvious expertise and experience that you have built up for many years. So thank you to you and your team. You're doing absolutely fantastic work. Thank you very much indeed.
I'll pass that on to my team as well.
Okay. So we'll keep away from the curbside then.
Yes.
And certainly I would not to worry if I ever see you driving the bus.
Well, yeah, no, I don't have the category of people I would like to see. Although that is the thought, isn't it? Okay, thank you all very, very much indeed. We're going to carry on. If you want to leave, because you've been very patient, and thank you all very much indeed for all your respective participation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The work programme, item 9 for information. Any issues that people wish to raise? Item 10, date of next meeting. What isn't in there is the motion board meeting, which is the one at 10 o'clock on the 24th, which is our final and possibly most crucial evidence gathering session on exempt accommodation, which has been rumbling on for some time. It's where we get the various bits of the council in the same room, and we want to hear them blame each other for why we're in this situation. And it's for us as councillors to nail down who is the cause of the massive explosion in exemplary testing. If it is within our own directors and departments. So, it's in this room, 10 o'clock on Friday the 24th. So I don't know whether you have all been sent the cumulative evidence.
The draft summary of evidence.
Draft summary of evidence.
That would be.
Did you put in a list of potential issues, questions that we wish to raise?
Yes, I think you shared that as well. So I think there are a couple of additional questions that I've also put into the final document.
Okay.
And we'll also have a session plan for the meeting itself.
And I'm conscious that the coffee machine or is there a cafe? The
cafe's open.
Yeah, I think it may go on for more than 2 hours. So I'm 3, yeah. So I'm planning on having a break halfway through for a coffee, physical need break, because I've noticed, I've crossed my legs. But so I am, and I'll bring some biscuits and possibly some healthy fruit for those people who I'm looking at who have.
Don't look at me.
Okay, so I'll bring an assortment of things as chair to sustain this during the argument.
But we also request that, obviously, we're all working and trying to go paperless. And if you can have extension leads possibly for.
Sorry, I did bring some along, but I'll put them out.
My battery was beginning to.
That's go through too.
Okay, item 11. Oh, sorry, Liz.
Just a subsequent meeting, are you going to be able to update us on staffing plans for the screening? I don't think that we've got any news. I don't know how we're going to start up the screening functions.
In fact, I think everybody knows, but I'm not sure. But I've got a new job, so I will be meeting this. I'll be meeting Birmingham in November.
Yeah, it's the bus. I don't know how we're going to cope.
Can you just go to Cornwall? Is that how we're going to do it?
Well, yes, I when she told me I was
on suicide watch.
But well, no, it's she'll explain, I suppose, in due course. But it's like a lot of people of our age, you were bigger than me, but elderly parents require. Okay. Family members who live a long way away, need support from time to time. And, we're all experiencing that. So it's nothing personal.
No, I am sorry to
so in terms of, I'm going to have a scrutiny chairs meeting in the near future where we can pick up on that, but also the everybody who's got a keen interest in scrutiny, we will praise you of what's going to happen. I think we're going to have something interim.
I think I'm going to, one of the things I want to pick up with you after this meeting is Suzanne to pick up on.
I'm not aware of it yet, but as soon as I get to hear, we will make sure everybody else gets to hear. But it is important that we replace Emma, both on an interim and a long-term basis, because it's going to be very, very difficult. She's been absolutely tremendous.
And that's the thing, is that we've had fantastic support, and we've got a range of really excellent officers, and we've been doing fantastic organisation and research for us, but I still, the whole thing still feels very, very thin. So we had John Cotton Scott's scrutiny, and there's stuff about the parachute scheme. It's not just the access to sector members, it is actually the capacity of the function to actually ask the challenging questions. And on the Commonwealth Games, and again, I think it's a collective responsibility, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface about it, really. And I feel the amount of resources it's taking, I'm not convinced really what the long-term benefits are going to be. I know that maybe just because of where I started in terms of what I think of the Commonwealth Games, but I think things like that actually we need to make some firepower hands to start asking the questions and to look at some of the financial commitments that were made when we got into this 3 years ago.
But it's going to be difficult, isn't it? 'Cause I mean, sort of, probably shouldn't say these things when Emma's in the room, but, you know, if you're doing a call-in or something like that, and Emma challenges something on the call-in, you know, fine, well, it's a genuine one regarding the system, you know, it's not a political thing at the back, you know, it's just basically why.
You always check with me first. How many teams?
But no, it is that thing, and it's just going to be that, it's trying to find someone who understands things and can move forward.
Yeah. No, it's, yeah. Okay. Request for calling. Okay, other urgent business? Authority to act. Thank you very much, Dean. So I'll see you all on the 24th.